Right. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Cecilia Dome. I'm the PI for the RCM project. I would like to welcome Professor Qingwen Chang to introduce our webinar speaker, Dr. Rebecca Muenich. Qingwen.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. Hi, I'm Jingwen Chen, Assistant Professor in Landscape Architecture Design School at Arizona State University. And along with Giulia Petrielli, we are the collaborators in this project. And today is my pleasure to introduce our colleague, Dr. Rebecca Muenich, for today's presentation. And she is Assistant Professor of School of Sustainable Engineering in the Built Environment. And she is also a program lead for agriculture and biodiversity at the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes in the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation. And she's also senior sustainability scientist at ASU. And Rebecca grew up in urban rural area in Arkansas, and so she understands the conflicts between food production and water quality, and that really drives her research area. And she has gained her bachelor's degree in biological engineering at the University of Arkansas, and with a minor in mathematics and geology. And she earned a master's and PhD in agriculture and biological engineering at Purdue University. And today she will talk about her new research project that she has been research on the quantifying ecosystem services and trade-offs in agricultural systems and the synergies to water quality and water systems. And she also did a postdoc at the University of Michigan, focused on addressing the algae bloom in the lake area. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Muenich. Thanks. You.
Thanks, Qingwen and Cecilia, Nuri, for everyone else at the RCN for inviting me. I'm happy to talk to you all today. I've mentioned it to the organizers a little bit, but this is some new work that sort of it's working on a publication for, but it's a work in progress, I'll say, just as before I even start. So I kind of titled this more broadly, but really, I was interested, as you heard from my background, I came from the Midwest, where we have a lot of large-scale agriculture and, working from home. Came from the Midwest, where we have a lot of large-scale agriculture. And when I moved here to ASU, I noticed there was a growing movement here and in a lot of cities to increase urban agriculture. So I kind of started to, as I got here in about 2017, I got more interested in how do we look at urban agriculture in the same way that we evaluate and look at conventional agriculture, especially since it's this growing proportion in many cities. So I'm going to talk to you about one of the projects that we've been working on and trying to just understand what's happening with urban agriculture. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators for this work I'm going to talk about. Emma Bonham is one of my undergraduate students who really took on this project and this data and analyzing it to get it to a form where we could talk about it. And then I'll talk about my collaborator, Dr. Elena Zanin, who's in the School of Communications at ASU, and her student, Chris Tizort, because the work that we are doing evolved from some work they were doing in terms of interviewing some farmers. So this project and some of the data I'm going to show you was supported both by the new Sweetie Center for Sustainable Food Systems we have here at ASU, which was the original project led by Dr. Zanin, and then a capacity building project we have with the USDA, which is really aimed at looking at this urban agriculture nexus where they kind of collide in cities and how to develop synergies between the two. So to get started, I just kind of want to back up and talk about, why I'm interested in urban agriculture. And this is, if you're unfamiliar with Arizona, this is Maricopa and Pinal counties. Maricopa is where we sit here. I'm not actually in Tempe, I'm in Phoenix because I'm at home, but that's where ASU's campus is. And all the red is urban lands. The yellow is agricultural lands. So you can kind of see two different stories here between Maricopa County and Pinal County. But the other thing you can also kind of imagine is most of that red historically was yellow. We've been expanding our urban areas very rapidly in Phoenix into agricultural areas. There's a lot of reasons for that. People want to live here because it's sunny, but also when we transition a field of agriculture to buildings or a residential lot, the water use is going to go down. So it's one of the ways that Arizona has been able to increase its population, but decrease its water use or maintain its water use depending on the area you're in. So this transition is well known. It's been happening here. It's this kind of expansion of urban areas into extant agricultural lands has been happening in a lot of urban places. In many cases, urban lands expand faster than the rate of the actual population growth. So we're taking up more land per person in a lot of places. And often this is occurring at the expense of agricultural lands. And this can be an issue for many reasons. Here, there's, I think, a lot of interesting issues to look into. You might see a benefit with water, but there could be something worsening with heat. But then the other kind of bigger issue is you're losing agriculture nearby. Are you also losing access to local food supplies, which really impacts that broader food, energy, water system that I know you guys have been talking a lot about. So urban agriculture, and I'm not going to get into definitions because there are certainly many definitions of urban ag. I'm just going to kind of broadly define it as agriculture happening in or near city boundaries. But it's kind of this solution that's been proposed to help supply cities, local communities with local food options in a sustainable manner. A lot of times, and there's been some studies on this, a lot of times these urban agriculture farms, their main goals are not always food production, which is very different from conventional agricultural production, where the biggest goal is to produce as much food as possible, right? Because that's the economic driver. Actually, in a lot of studies of urban farmers, they might have a goal of, being a space for the community to come together, or providing opportunities to interact with the environment. There's these other goals that urban farmers have that is not often the primary goal in conventional agriculture. So anyways, there's this not new, it's been around for a while. And of course, we used to all have backyard gardens, but urban agriculture has been poised as this great solution to address local food supply in cities, especially in places with food desert, which Arizona certainly has a lot of. However, we really don't know a lot about urban farms in general. So there's a big survey that the USDA does of agriculture every 5 years. It's called the Agricultural Census, just like we have the census of people, but this one's every 5 years. And it's supposed to capture every farm, but there's been studies that show it's hard for that census to capture urban farms because they are more transient, they're smaller in scale, and I'll show you some data on some of the sizes of some of the farms we've worked with. But it's sometimes really hard to capture them, and even if they are in the census, they sort of get dwarfed by the really large farms, and it's really hard to try and understand what's going on, what kind of practices these farms are using in order to think about their sustainability. So, that's one of the big issues is we just don't know a lot about what they're growing, how they're growing it, and how that might contribute to sustainability. One of the other kind of known issues that can, lead to potential sustainability issues with urban growers is many of them do not have a background in agriculture. They, may have, there's lots of anecdotal stories from the interviews we did where they were working a city job, got kind of stressed out and, really wanted to get back to their community. And so they started, a community farm that grew into a bigger, maybe entrepreneurial farm. And so, although lots of experience comes from practice, without that kind of initial agricultural knowledge, and there not being maybe as many resources out there for urban farmers, some of the practices may not align with typical best practices that we would see in other kinds of agriculture. So I kind of made this little picture over here, but there are a lot of inputs that happen in agriculture. And then when you juxtapose agriculture next to a city or in a city, that means you have agriculture happening around people, which we know agriculture, when you're working with the land, you can release things in the soil, you can release things to the air, release things to the water. So can be some issues when you're farming in and around people. And this has been well studied in conventional agriculture, less so in sort of urban agricultural settings. So for this work, it's really kind of a pilot study, but to just try and get into understanding what's happening with urban farmers here. So the first question that we had are, what are common urban farming practices that desert cities, basically around here and down towards Tucson are using, because we just don't know. So that's, very basic question, but we need to know that before we can really start to work with any of the data. And then one of our questions was essentially related to the sustainability of the farming practices that they're using. And we, you all probably know, and I'm not, sustainability has multiple aspects to it. So one of the things we did was ask them how sustainable they felt their practices were, because we want to compare the practices they're doing to how sustainable they feel like they're being, since sustainability is sort of a spectrum, and there are, of course, many different aspects to it. But we wanted to see, do the way they think their sustainability of their practices match with what their farming practices are. So those are kind of our driving research questions. The methods we have. So again, I mentioned this work sort of evolved out of a study that Dr. Zanin was doing. So her and her student were conducting interviews with urban farmers in Arizona to try and understand their choices and reasons for doing things. When we connected, I was really interested in, can we add questions about practices? So from the very beginning of their work, they were asking about practices. They helped train my student Emma, who was able to also help conduct interviews. And by the end, we ended up with 17 interviews of farmers that identified as urban farmers in the way that they sell their produce at farmers markets. Not all of them are necessarily in urban areas, but so these are more diverse local growers from Phoenix to Tucson. And then, so even though her work was focused on something else, we did add a significant number of questions trying to glean what their farming practices were, which was, as you'll see in a little bit, quite difficult. And then what our goal was eventually to rank these practices according to their likely environmental sustainability. So I'm going to focus entirely on the environmental sustainability of urban farming, and not sort of the social and economic parts, which are definitely important, but we have to start somewhere. So really focusing on, can we essentially quantify their practices, put a score of sustainability to those practices that we can then compare to their own definition of, are they being sustainable? And then what we're doing now, we're starting to visit some of the farms that we've interviewed for a number of reasons. One is to confirm practices, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then the other is to get some environmental samples, because it's one thing to hear about what people are doing and to try and assess the sustainability from just what they say they're doing, but without actually getting samples from the farm, it's really hard to say one way or the other if those practices are sustainable. So that's kind of what we're working on. Again, I mentioned this is a work in progress, and we're even still working on the ranking that I'm going to talk about next. So I put this big table up here, but I'm going to try and walk you through it. Of course, we can't assess every single practice, but these are some of the main farming practices that we assessed, and I'll talk about why. So crop choice was the first. We just want to know, what are you growing? And all of our sustainability scores went from 1 to 3, 1 being we don't think that's likely to be sustainable, 3 that's likely to be pretty sustainable, and 2 either we didn't have enough information or it's, you know, kind of a subjective call. So it's sort of in between sustainable and not. So we wanted to go with a simple system first, just because there are a lot of things we're looking at. This is the first kind of attempt we're doing to quantify this. So again, three system, 3-point scale, and then we looked at these practices. So crop choice. So if they had crops that we felt were water or nutrient intensive, that would be put into the more unsustainable category. If they had maybe native crops, or they had crops that were water or nutrient efficient, that was a 3. If they had too many, which I will tell you, some of the farms grew hundreds of things, that's really hard to put a very simple score on. So we put those into number 2. And then we looked at irrigation, because here in desert cities, that's really important. And they're not going to be able to do completely rain-fed agriculture like you can in some parts of the country. So irrigation is really an important piece of the sustainability assessment. So we looked at source. So potable city water was given a 1, just because that city water has to be treated. That requires a lot of energy. It takes out nutrients that the crops could actually use. So for those reasons, we put potable city water as a 1. Whereas if they were using reclaimed water, if they were collecting rainwater on site, or a mix of options, that was sort of given a 3. Well water was given a 2, though depending on where they are, maybe it should be a 1. Again, these are subjective. But you know, we have a lot of issues with groundwater depletion here, so wells may not be that sustainable of an option depending on where you are. Then we looked at irrigation method, and we saw a variety of methods. So some people were hand watering with a hose, which we put as a 1 because it's even harder to really control your amounts that way. Some were using flood irrigation and sprinkler systems, which was given a 2. And then people using drip methods. There were 2 hydroponic growers included in this study. And then some ebb and flow irrigation methods were given a 3, so that, you know, there was more control in terms of those kinds of options. And then timing. So when and how often do they irrigate? That was the third piece that we looked at with water. Many just use intuition. They just basically, you know, said, oh, when the soil looks wet or dry or whatever, then I'm going to irrigate. So that was given a 1. Watering on a regular basis, that can be a pretty conventional practice, especially if you change that timing with the season here. And then some people had actually installed soil moisture sensors and were using that to water, so we gave that a 3. And then of course hydroponics is very water efficient, so we put that in the 3 category. Then we went down to sort of other additions. So pesticides. If they were using synthetic pesticides, we put that in the 1. If they were using only organic pesticides, a 2. And then if they were using no pesticides, we kind of went with the assumption that they didn't need them. And that was probably because they were creating a nice ecosystem that had its own controls on pests. And then we get into fertilizer, which you'll see in a little bit. This is sort of my real interest is in fertilizers, nutrients. That's kind of my big bread and butter. So we looked at fertilizer type. So were they using synthetic? That's a 1. So synthetic fertilizers, they use a lot of fossil fuels to be either mined. For phosphorus, it's mined from phosphate rock. Nitrogen, as you probably know, comes from the Haber-Bosch process, which we pull it from the air, very energy intensive. So using those, a 1. If they were using organic fertilizers or a combination of organic and synthetic, we put that in a 2. And if they were only using, excuse me, organic, that should also be in 3. Organic fertilizers, or you know, maybe from compost on site, recycled options, like you know, just manure nearby or something, or none. And then again, assuming that if they don't need it, then their soils are healthy, then that got a 3. And then fertilizer calculations, kind of similar to thinking about how often to apply water, how often do they apply fertilizer, and how do they determine how much they need? So a lot of them said, intuition, they just apply what they feel is needed. We even had one farmer say that as soon as someone would give them some manure and they would apply it, regardless of if they might need it. Some farmers said they had some occasional tests. So maybe when they started out their farm, they got some soil tests done and then they apply based on that. But typically aren't doing any calculations to figure out how much to apply. And then there were some farms who were testing each growing season, their soil, doing some calculations to figure out how much their crops were actually going to need and need to remove. So then they were basing their amounts applied on that. And I'll just note that, the reason we care about fertilizers is those nutrients in excess get leached into the groundwater. They can get into surface waters and cause issues with an imbalance of those nutrients in ecosystems. And then we looked at these other practices, which ended up being a little more yes, no, where we had more of an open-ended question about other practices they were doing. So some we didn't ask specifically about. So some of them we weren't sure if people were doing them or not because they didn't mention them. But crop rotation is one where typically if you do it, this is going to be a good practice. And if you don't, it's not ideal because of pest regulation. If you have the same crop over and over in the same place, you can get pests in the soil or above the soil. So that's typically not a recommended practice. Tilling, if they're tilling in a very intensive way, that's typically not environmentally sustainable, just because that can release all the things in your soil, the next time it rains. It is good in a lot of cases to do that for your plants so that you're mixing up the soil, but a healthy soil doesn't always need to be tilled. So if they're not tilling, that was kind of our best assessment. And then cover crops, which we ask, or some people talked about, they're maybe not as common here, and they're really common in the Midwest. And typically you would apply them over the winter when you're not growing anything as soil cover. So we did find that some farmers were doing this here when they weren't growing. Now that could have some issues. We put that as sustainable here, but likely unless those crops are native, you may have to water those. So that could cause some extra issues with sustainability. But for now we went with yes, that was sustainable, but not having them may not necessarily mean it's not sustainable. And then composting. So, reusing some of the organic waste they had on farm as a sustainable practice. And then the last thing we looked at was the use of large equipment like tractors, and whether or not those were driven by fossil fuels or electric, or if they were electric. So again, this is not an exhaustive list of all the practices, but this was a pretty good start, we feel, and trying to go with a simple method here, but it is still a work in progress. So getting on to results, again, we had 17 farms. You'll notice we go up to farmer 19. That's because we had some interviews scheduled that didn't happen over the pandemic. So I just put all these up here to give you an idea of the variability in these farms. So we had the smallest farm was this first one, 0.005 acres, so very small. And then we have the largest one of 20,000 acres. So likely that one is a conglomerate of multiple farms, but you can see if you just read through, pick a random one and read through, they're growing a lot of different things, which is very different than conventional agriculture where, it might be a monoculture, it might be a rotation of 2 to 3 crops that are more typical because you're working on a very large scale, and with scale often comes efficiency and the need for efficiency. So, but you can see there's a really wide variety. So as soon as I put this up here, you can probably imagine that it's hard to sort of put some of these farms into one of those 3 categories for each of those things that we evaluated, but we're trying. So that's kind of a look at what they are growing. Now I just want to talk about kind of the results in terms of practices. So with respect to water, most of the farmers are getting all or some of their water from municipal potable sources. So That means that basically they're using tap water to water their plants, which again has some issues and implications for the few nexus, because that water has gone through treatment to be drinking water quality, which again removes valuable nutrients in the process and is energy intensive. So this may not be ideal and could be an issue in the future for the sustainability of urban agriculture. So finding alternative sources for these farms might be something that needs to be done. The majority of these farms were using drip systems, or they might have like drip combined with some flooding to leach the salts out of their soils. But most of them said they were using drip. So that tends to be good in this climate. But I'll talk about the trade-off there with quality in a little bit. And then irrigation timing for the most part was not done by a measurement of soil moisture, but based on intuition, or they were just saying, oh, I just regularly apply water every 2 to 3 hours without kind of a calculation of how much I'm applying. So, you know, thinking about water shortages and the drought that we're facing here in Arizona, you know, there's a lot of room to improve on some of these practices that are going on these farms in terms of their water usage. Nutrients. So all but 2 of the farms only used organic fertilizers, and many of them said in their interviews, you know, we're an organic only farm. The 2 farms that did use synthetic only applied synthetic nitrogen, which is important, and I'll talk about that later. And then only 2 of the farms actually did regular testing of their soils to determine their crop nutrient needs. And I'll show you through the case studies why this should be a practice that should be done on a regular basis by all farms. In terms of pesticides, 7 of them used organic pesticides. The other 10 didn't use any. So pretty low input in terms of pesticides. Crop rotation, 6 indicated that they were practicing rotations with their crops. 7 said they were regularly tilling their soils. So a lot were not tilling, which is typically a good situation. And then 3 were using cover crops. 6 composted on site and used that compost as a amendment to their soil. And then 7 were using large equipment, with 6 of them requiring fossil fuels. You can imagine those are probably the larger farms because that tends to be sort of necessary when you grow beyond a certain size. Now I want to talk a little bit about the sustainability assessment. So for each of those practices that we ask about, we had 2 people code, you know, the sustainability score for each of the practices. Then we averaged the score for the farm. Again, it could be, you know, from 1 to 3. So the lowest score we had was 1.83, the highest was 2.5, average of 2.2 across all farms, which, if you remember my categories, really means that it's hard to tell because sustainability, even just looking at the environmental sustainability of these farms, is complicated. And again, yes, it was very difficult, and a lot of times to, especially from just the interviews, to assign scores because 1, there's just many aspects to sustainability, but sometimes the information we had from the interviews didn't help us pick a category. But I still wanted to show you some of the results of comparing those scores to their own definitions. And I picked in these next two slides, 2 quotes that I thought were kind of interesting, where juxtaposing sort of one of the lower scores with one of the higher scores. So one of the highest scores, 2.5, says, in response to, are your farming practices sustainable, or do you think they're sustainable? They said, oh yeah. And that's one reason we do regenerative farming, because that's the most sustainable or progressive. So we see sort of an alignment between their score and what they feel they were doing. But we see that one of the lower scores also says, oh yeah. And then they talk about, some qualifications to that, but for the most part, they feel they're doing, sustainable practices, but that doesn't necessarily align with what we saw from their score. Again, remembering that the score does have a lot of subjectivity to it. And then similarly, another higher to lower score, this was interesting because this farm that had a higher overall score said that they're not in a sustainable position, and that's a bigger, they were pretty insightful. This is a bigger question about sustainability. I've been working on this for 9 years, and it doesn't seem that sustainability is realistic, which I think is a really interesting take, and something we definitely have to challenge ourselves on. And then similarly, the lowest, this was the lowest score, said, yeah, I mean, can we improve? Absolutely. So, you know, it was just interesting. These quotes were similar, even though their scores were pretty different in terms of their practices, which again, we're only focusing on environmental sustainability of their practices here. So I think there's, you know, some interesting things to be addressed, because outside of maybe 2 farmers, when they were asked if their, you know, practices are sustainable, everyone said yes. But it doesn't seem that all the practices that they're working on are all sustainable. So, and maybe that isn't possible to achieve, you know, according to one farmer. So I think it's just something interesting to explore further. So I want to kind of move on and talk about some on-farm analysis and things that we want to do. One of the things that happen is that, one, I mentioned it was just really hard to assess environmental sustainability of the practices based on their interviews alone. This is a lot due to the complexity and to the diversity of the farms in this study. You know, they're growing a bunch of things. They might have multiple fields that they're managing in different ways. So really assessing that from an interview is difficult. So what we really are interested in is trying to get out to farms to collect data that can support our assessments. We were trying to do this last year, but of course, COVID-19 hit, and you know, visiting farms wasn't feasible for me and my students. But we did get to 2 farms this late in this semester, so I have some data to show you from that, and I think it paints some interesting new pictures here. I also just want to mention, because of COVID and sort of time constraints, we really only focused on nutrient management practices. So how much fertilizers they're applying or soil amendments they're applying, and then looking at soil tests essentially. But we'd like to expand this in the future to look at, you know, how much water is being applied versus, you know, crop needs, what kind of pests are there or not. You know, there's a lot of ways that we could collect some data to support, you know, our assessments of sustainability. So I'm going to talk about the 2 farms we visited. Case study 1 and 2 is what I'm going to call them. The first one had a really high, one of the highest sustainability score, 2.5. This farm is in southern Arizona. They grow a large variety of plants in an open field. This was, I think, one of the smaller farms, you know, less than an acre. They do have it all fenced in. They have anything from fruit trees to tea plants to flowers that they sell at the local farmers market. So I mean, when I mean variety, I mean they had a large variety of things. They typically divided their, even though it was a really small farm, they divided it into 4 management zones that they did different things to, and all the zones were equipped with drip irrigation that was tied to a well that they basically turned on when they thought it was needed. So kind of that intuition practice of irrigation. And then all fertilizer was all organic. And this was the farm that said, we just apply it whenever we get it. So they said, oh, you know, my neighbor had some alpaca manure that they gave me, so I put it on my fields. So they weren't testing their soils. They weren't testing what the, you know, manures or other fertilizers they were using had in it, and we're just applying it without regard to what their crops need. So this is what we tested their soil. And I know this is a big table. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the first sample was from their land, but a place where they weren't doing any agriculture, just kind of as a baseline. And then these were from the, you know, they had 4 different management zones. So these names don't really mean anything except to remind them where they're from. But the key over here, we're looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, and salinity. So nitrogen, phosphorus being key nutrients for plant growth. Salinity can be detrimental for plant growth, so we don't want it to be high. And what you see is huge amounts of phosphorus reserves in this soil. And you can even see that the sample we took from sort of native nearby was also really high. So it might, you know, they might have been plagued by the fact that they already had high phosphorus in their soils. And then, you know, the fact that they're just adding organic residuals, when they get them, they're building up their phosphorus supply in their soil well beyond crop needs. Even in some cases, they have really high nitrogen values, which, that can even contribute to greenhouse gases because it has this gaseous component to the cycle. So what I want to point out here, and something I mentioned I would discuss earlier, is that we saw the two farms that were applying synthetic fertilizers were applying nitrogen. And that is typically and most likely because organic fertilizers, manures, compost, like vermicompost, whatever you're applying, is going to be a lot higher in phosphorus than nitrogen. And the reason that can be an issue is that crops need more nitrogen than phosphorus. So when you're applying a lot of these organic options, you're over applying phosphorus if you're trying to meet the nitrogen requirements that your crops need. And so the farms that were using synthetic nitrogen, it was likely because they were testing. They know that they're low on nitrogen, but they're high in phosphorus due to their addition of organic residuals. So they need to supply that nitrogen. There's not really a lot of options to supply nitrogen only from organic options. So that can be a limitation in organic farming. So the other issue, salinity. So you can see some pretty high salinity in a few spots on their farm, and in other places it's kind of okay. Salinity, of course, can be detrimental to crops. And one of the things, it looks like somebody might be annotating on the screen. It's not me. So salinity, the reason it might be associated in a problem in this farm, and you'll see in the next farm, is drip irrigation. So drip irrigation tends to concentrate a lot of the salts at the top of the soil. And when you're not regularly flushing the soils here, that salt just stays on top of the soil. And so a very common practice here is to leach the soils at least once a year to release that salt to lower levels in the soil profile. So that's kind of a missing knowledge piece in some cases where people may be using drip irrigation, but not flushing. It looks like the annotation is still happening. I'm not sure what's going on there. But if you're not flushing that salt through in a drip system, you can get salt buildup, which can be really bad for plant health. So, this was interesting. Sorry, there's like rainbows happening on my slide here. So the reason this was interesting, if I go back to the last slide, is this farm had a pretty high sustainability score, but based on these data that we collected on site, they're having issues with their soil quality and their soil health. So, that's where, we might look at individual pieces of their environmental sustainability, like their nutrient management, their soils, just to really try and further understand the sustainability of that piece specifically. But it also just kind of paints this bigger picture of how complex this is. So the second case study had a sustainability score of 2.33, so pretty high compared to the rest. Again, in Southern Arizona, about 5 acres, mostly vegetables, grew a lot of garlic, interestingly, and mostly open fields, but they did have 2 hoop houses, which are just like greenhouses, except the floor is, you plant crops in the ground. You don't have them raised up like you typically do in greenhouses. They were doing drip irrigation from a well as well, and doing it based on intuition again, only organic fertilizers. They had some soil tests in the past, but hadn't had anything recently and weren't regularly testing or doing any calculations. So we see a similar story, though not quite as concerning. We saw, interestingly enough, they had a really high nitrogen value. So I'm really curious to explore this a little bit more, how they got way more nitrogen than phosphorus in this soil. But still had some high phosphorus in a couple places, and then a little bit of a high salinity, which could be an issue for them in the future. So again, high sustainability score, but we're seeing some issues with sort of the soils in their farm, the building blocks. So something that probably needs to be addressed. So from these case studies, some of the things we really learned is that being on farm was really important to get reliable information about management. When we actually talked to farmers in person on their farm about their practices, we got different answers to their practice questions than they provided in the interviews, which was interesting. And likely because in the interviews, I think they were talking about their practices in general, which may be from 5 years ago. Whereas when we were on farm, we were able to ask, more specifically, what are you growing right now? What are you planning to grow? What did you just harvest? So really being on farm was important to make sure we get, the most reliable information. And then again, it's still really difficult with diverse systems to assign a simple score. Especially without collecting samples. So the kind of divergence between like the high sustainability score, but the issues with the soil could be a problem that maybe if we can collect more samples, we can do a better job at assigning sustainability scores. And again, it's really difficult for urban farmers using organic practices to get those nutrient needs right. Just kind of the issue I talked about before, that a lot of those organic residuals are high in phosphorus, so more phosphorus than is needed, but lower in nitrogen. So, getting the nitrogen right without affecting and making the phosphorus too high is tricky. So I think these that from the case studies and just reviewing the practices and trying to assess their sustainability, there's really two emergent issues that desert urban farmers need to address. And one is drip irrigation and the buildup of salts and making sure that they're flushing salts, but also addressing the use of organic fertilizers and making sure that they're testing regularly both the soils, what they're applying, and really trying to figure out what their crops need so that they're not getting really out of proportion with their nutrients that are in their soil, and so that doesn't become an environmental risk factor. So just a little bit on kind of what we're doing now, kind of and into the future. We're trying to get more data from more farms. This has actually been a really interesting way, one learning experience for me and my students, but also we are providing this data to farms for free through some of the grants that we have. It is expensive to test soil. It's expensive to test compost. And if you're growing multiple crops, if you have a lot of management zones, this can, be astronomically expensive. So, I definitely think that urban farmers need more resources in terms of helping them make sure they're doing sustainable practices. So, we're happy to be able to do this on a small scale with some of the farmers in terms of providing this data so they can make better decisions. But it's something that should be addressed. We're still trying to refine our scoring method. For instance, I mentioned 2 of the farms were hydroponics. How do you really compare that with an open field farm? Well, it's very difficult. So we're exploring that at the moment. We also want to kind of compare urban ag practices here to those in other environments and see what kind of variation we see. And then, I think one of the bigger questions that we get a lot is, how do these practices compare and their impacts on the environment compared to, conventional production systems in the area? And then I always like to leave the last slide as my kind of conclusions and final thoughts. I think managing a farm that's pretty diverse, that's not a monoculture or not a, 2-3 crop rotation in an environmentally sustainable way is really going to be difficult. And it's going to be hard to monitor and assess sustainability of these farms just because there's so much diversity. So, I think we need to do a lot in terms of developing approaches for that. The other thing is, sustainability is a spectrum and I only focus here on environmental sustainability again, but even within that, there's so much trade-off. And I think this lends itself to the topic of your RCN few trade-offs and what do we value more in the few nexus in terms of environmental sustainability, and maybe that differs by the location of the farm. So that's one other point. And then, again, I just want to reiterate that urban ag is, and the sustainability of it is more than just environmental sustainability, but if you don't have this core piece of sustainability, then we're going to not have, urban agriculture is not going to be a viable option to address this expanse of urban lands and this need to have more local food. If we're, putting our environment even more at risk with these systems, then it can't be a sustainable solution. So we definitely have to address this, even though I know that there are other aspects of sustainability that we weren't looking at. And then I think, what we really need to do is work with urban growers who have these diverse systems and these, very different approaches to management to help identify, how do we move towards being able to do some of the things we do in conventional agriculture in terms of monitoring the farms and the environment of the farms. And so I really think we need to work with these growers who have, this experience with these diverse systems to figure out how do we ensure their sustainability into the future. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I hope I have time for questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, we have few questions. I think this research is super important to start measuring urban agriculture sustainability. I will start calling, please, if everyone before speaking can unmute. I have a question from Jorge Ponte Gomez.
Yeah. Excuse me. Right now we're suffering of poverty in Colombia, especially in La Guajira, in the North region. And we have also need for food security. But the terrains, the land is so poor. We can use your technology and your knowledge to improve the way of living of the Wayu people, for instance.
So yeah, are you talking about using like urban agriculture to address some of that food insecurity in the region?
Exact.
Yeah.
Right now, many of the procuring of food is using cattle and cows, but they need to improve the food safety, and we need to produce food right there in the desert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, desert food production is a challenge. A lot of people will say, you shouldn't have food production in the desert, but sun is a key ingredient for growing food. And you can grow food, and I'm not sure about there, but here you can grow crops all year round here, and you can grow multiple crops. Whereas, a lot of places in the Midwest, we grow like one crop per year. So there's a lot of opportunity if you have the water and you can get the water resources. So water and food, really are this big issue in desert communities. But, I think urban ag can definitely be a solution, or small scale ag. If you think about, in the US and much of places in the world, everybody used to have a cow in their backyard and a little vegetable garden. But the problem with that is it's really inefficient. And as, populations grow, we need to, there was a huge need, to produce more food on the same amount of land in order to feed a growing population. So we really shifted our food system to be, large scale, but very efficient. So very efficient with inputs, like something like 90 in the US, 90% of nutrients supplied on big farms stays on the farm. So, there's this huge efficiency push. But, with that push came some loss and, thinking about the other aspects of environmental quality. So, in my opinion, we need some sort of mixes of, a more diverse agricultural system, one that has both, smaller diverse farms, but still maintains some big efficient farms. So, every region is different. And I, without knowing more about that region in Colombia, I can't really say a whole lot, but, there's probably a lot of indigenous knowledge that can be learned. I think we're still learning about, crops, or even livestock that, fare better in desert environments, that can be better utilized with, that are more water efficient, kind of back to that first piece of assessing sustainability. And then, anytime you can, utilize resources that are local too, without, bringing in water from elsewhere, or, mining, purchasing mined fertilizers and really, using some organic residuals that are around, those kinds of things can really advance both food security and environmental sustainability in many places.
Thank you. We have one more question from George Brooks.
Oh,
George.
hello. I thought I wrote the question down. Good to see you, Rebecca. I have a PhD from University of Arizona in ag, and I've been involved in Arizona agriculture for about 40 years, and helped to write some of the rules for urban ag in the city of Phoenix. And there's a lot to unpack here, but to begin, in your study, did you talk to or did they respond, the Maricopa County Food Coalition, did they respond to your study as far as the questions you asked?
No, so this was only interviews with urban producers, so only producers.
Well, that's who they are.
So we didn't ask if they were members of Marco, no.
Okay. No, that was my major question. Did you have a chance to look at the arsenic problem as far as the contaminating the soils in their main areas?
No, so yeah, we, the amount of money we had available to do some of the actual testing was small. So the more things we added, the more expensive it was going to be. So we didn't test for arsenic in the soils. We did actually collect from those two farms well water, which is still being processed, and we did run those for arsenic just to check. But these two farms are actually southern Arizona. They were in Phoenix and Maricopa County. So we haven't gotten those results back, but we will have those at some point. But yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of questions around, potential legacy contaminants when you're farming in urban areas. And I've definitely seen, I visited one, this isn't one that was in this study, but there was a farm I visited that had been in the past, I think the earliest anyone knew it was a dairy farm, small dairy farm, and it turned into an automotive site. And then it, went through all these different stages of development. So there was, likely to have a lot of contaminants on it, but there were in-ground gardens. So it's something that certainly needs to be looked at in urban farms.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I'll come back around if there's time.
I also know you, George. You can just shoot me your email or we can chat.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, we have a few more questions. One is from Professor Hilary Brown.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really useful study and compellingly presented. I'm just thinking, going forward with your study, or if this were to be replicated in other urban environments, had you considered as one of the criterion whether land use efficiency as a sustainability criterion? For example, rooftop farms, which double up land use, or agro PV farms, as opposed to green fields, and also maybe the consideration of remediated brownfields versus green fields.
No, but I think that's definitely a good idea for future work. As I mentioned, this is a definite work in progress, and we'd love to look at other places. I even think here, land, even though it seems like it's sort of unlimited with the desert, but it's really not. And there's a lot of competing options, and land is expensive here, so there's probably also that economic and even social component that could be looked at as well with respect to land. But I like that idea, so thank you.
And one other quick thing, the application of permaculture principles, intercropping, things like that might be, maybe you haven't seen those present, but they're sort of an add-on to your list.
Yeah, definitely. So I didn't see any in these farms. Some of the farms kind of talk about doing some of that, but it didn't seem like they were actually doing it. But I have seen some other farms that we didn't interview that are doing that. So definitely something to add to the list.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have David Baxter.
Hi there. Sorry, I just wanted to unmute. I used to do a lot of work with the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management in Maricopa County and in your general area of your project study. And at one time, there were opportunities that were explored for land exchanges, to ensure compact agricultural tracts, also, the canals and the transportation of water across federal lands, etc. And then primarily also with the some of the Native American tribes in this specific area around, the Phoenix area, who had limited access to water rights and etc. I was just wondering if you have been working with any of these agencies and potential stakeholders, and what interest might have been shown in the wonderful work that you're doing.
I haven't. Again, I actually haven't. This is the first time I presented this work at all. So it's very new. We do, for the USDA grant that I manage, we have a stakeholder advisory board. I don't think there's anyone from BLM on it, but we have some similar entities represented. And we don't have any tribal entities represented. We do have a liaison, a tribal liaison at ASU who's on our advisory board. But there's definitely completely different kinds of farming systems that can happen on the tribal lands that are in and around Maricopa County as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I was just thinking that they would be a very good target audience because they often, they're very close to Phoenix, and some of the the Gila innovation like abuts right up to Phoenix, and so I'm sure there'd be interest or value for them as well in what you're doing. So it's just a query, and and I wish you luck.
Okay, thank you.
So someone mentioned that if we will have a second or a following up meeting about this topic in our page on LinkedIn, we will be posting the upcoming webinars, and there is one later on related to food and water. We are now in the climate, and then later on we will have energy and water, and again we will go back to food. So please stay in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Cecilia?
Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you very much for the wonderful talk and share your research. I think it's a lot of interest, both in academia as well as the practitioners, and also I think some urban planners will also be interested. We do have, in our network, we do have our architects who owns a farm and then work with local farmers. So we'll hopefully connect with everyone in a later session. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we can bring everybody in person and meet again. Thank you very much for the talk. And I really enjoy all the information that you have shared. I think we can share this information, the presentation, if everybody's interested later on our website. Please follow the conversation. If you wanted to connect with any of the researchers, use our linking page, use our project website to reach out. And I hope to see you guys soon in our future presentation. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Rebecca.